This beautiful building behind me is Kew Palace. Built in 1631, this is one of the oldest buildings at Kew, originally built by a very wealthy Dutch silk merchant. It later became a royal palace and was lived in by King George III.
The palace was used as a retreat for Queen Charlotte and her children, and was an important refuge for King George III, who was suffering from ill health, later becoming known as Mad King George. The palace was transferred to the ownership of Kew Gardens along with Queen Charlotte's cottage in 1898 by Queen Victoria, allowing it to be open to the public. The building is now in the trust of Historic Royal Palaces and is open each year from the 3rd of April until the 30th of September. However, the beautiful gardens which lie behind the palace are open year-round, containing a fascinating medicinal herb garden.
This beautiful wall-trained tree behind me is a fig tree, Ficus carica. We don't know the exact age of this tree, but it's estimated to be around 60 years old. It's trained every winter, pruning it in January before the sap begins to flow to avoid bleeding.
This specimen looks fantastic when it's in full leaf, but it doesn't produce much fruit, probably because it doesn't receive enough light. However, for the past 2 years we have adjusted our pruning to ensure that young juvenile fruits were left on the tree, which overwinter and successfully ripen the following year.
This is the other side of Kew Palace, and in fact this was originally intended to be the front of the palace, which faces the River Thames. To my left is a beautiful medicinal herb garden, and to the right is a formal parterre in the French Renaissance style.
The gardens surrounding the palace that you see here are not original features of this site, and there is actually no evidence of any previous garden being here. The earliest illustrations of this area show the land between the palace and river as a grazing paddock which would have been prone to flooding. At some point the river embankment was made to prevent flooding, and in the 1950s Sir George Taylor, director of Kew Gardens, came up with a plan to construct a garden in a style contemporary with the palace. These gardens contain a range of features popular in the 17th century, and are stocked with plants of that period in keeping with the history of the palace.
I absolutely love this time of year when the laburnum comes into flower. Laburnum is a beautiful ornamental flowering tree, which at Kew has been trained over this archway to show off its beautiful hanging clusters of yellow flowers. It's commonly known as a poisonous plant, and in fact all parts of the plant are toxic, especially the seeds. However, it does have some very interesting medicinal properties.
Laburnum contains a very useful alkaloid called cytosine, which can be used as an emetic to cause vomiting, used in the treatment of whooping cough and asthma, and is very effective in helping people to quit smoking, as cytosine blocks nicotine's access to the brain's pleasure receptors. This medicinal herb garden contains a very diverse collection of plants, all of which have either current or historical use in medicine.
This lovely plant next to me is Viburnum opulus, a really nice plant native to the UK, producing these balls of creamy white flowers, followed by beautiful shiny red berries.
This plant is commonly called the Guelder rose or cramp bark, alluding to its use medicinally to reduce inflammation, swollen glands, relieving menstrual cramps and other muscle spasms, as well as many other applications. Superficially, these plants which we may have in our own gardens are seen as purely ornamental. However, so many of these plants, such as this one, have incredibly useful medicinal properties.
One of the fascinating things about studying medicinal plants is when you realise how many commonly found plants contain very useful medicinal compounds. There are so many species, commonly thought of as weeds, that have very beneficial medicinal properties.
This is Euphorbia pepulus, commonly called petty spurge, an extremely common weed which I'm sure most of you have weeded out before. However, secretly, this little plant contains an amazing compound which has been shown to successfully treat non-melanoma skin cancers. The medicinal herb garden is composed of a sunken garden surrounded by a raised walkway with a laburnum pergola and a gazebo based on an original one still present at Packwood House.
I've got to show you one of my favourite plants in the medicinal herb garden.
This is Silybum marianum, which, apart from its rather amusing name, is a beautiful herbaceous plant with these very ornamental variegated leaves, later producing purple thistle-like flowers. Medicinally, this plant contains a compound called silymarin, which is used to help protect the liver and kidney cells from the toxic effects of drugs such as chemotherapy. It has so many other medicinal uses, and research is still ongoing into the anti-cancer properties that this plant may have.
This is a really interesting plant that we grew last year. This is Isatis tinctoria, commonly known as woad, which was famously used by the Celts, who used it to make a blue dye to paint their skin with. The dye is made by macerating the leaves, which you can see already have a slightly blue colour to them. But this plant does have a range of other interesting medicinal properties.
Both the leaves and roots contain antibacterial and anti-cancer properties, being used to treat infections of the nose, throat and sinuses, and it's thought that Isatis may contain chemicals that prevent cancer cells from multiplying. The principal sources of information for the plants used in this garden come from the works of Gerard and John Parkinson, both famous herbalists from the 16th and 17th century. Throughout this garden you can see quotes from Gerard's and John Parkinson's famous herbals printed on a number of the plant labels. Now we are entering the formal parterre. This is planted with traditional low box hedging, lavender and Santolina, commonly called cotton lavender. An interesting feature of the parterre are these 5 stone statues, known as terms. Their exact age is unknown, but they are some of the oldest statues at Kew, probably dating back to the period of William Kent in the early 18th century, but little more than this is known about them. This parterre is actually copied from a design from a French garden called Verneuil. At the centre of the garden is an ornate Venetian wellhead given in 1958 to commemorate Sir George Taylor, with his initials GT at the top. And further back is a pool with a beautiful statue and fountain at the centre, which is a copy of Verrocchio's Boy with a Dolphin. Interestingly, all of this box hedging was grown from 1,500 cuttings of box which were sent to Kew for this parterre from a 17th century garden at Pit Meaden in Scotland. Here, at the one end of the hornbeam walk, is this beautiful decorative stone vase which is a replica of one found at Hampton Court Palace. Shaded walkways were an important feature of many 17th century gardens. These pleached hornbeams or boscage provides a refuge from the sun during the summer, and beneath it cyclamen, snowdrops and narcissus bloom earlier in the year. Essentially, this is a hedge on stilts. These hornbeams are trained and carefully pruned each year to ensure it stays in shape. This mound is another traditional feature of 17th century gardens, deriving from a time when in the enclosed gardens of monasteries and castles, a lookout point allowed views of the land beyond. This mount provides a lovely vantage point from which you can not only see the gardens, but also the River Thames beyond the wall. This beautiful wrought iron rotunda trailage was specially designed for this garden, sitting majestically at the top of this mound, beautifully framing views out over the surrounding landscape. If you look closely, you'll see the four motifs of England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales incorporated in the design. The Scottish thistle, the English rose, the Welsh leek, and the Irish clover. Beautiful elderflower in bloom, Sambucus nigra, from which a lovely refreshing summer drink is made using the flowers. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed this walk around the Queen's Garden at Kew. I looked after this garden for over 2 years, and it really is one of the most beautiful and fascinating areas of Kew Gardens. I hope you're all well. Please join me again in another video.